The first step is for a user to ask an administrator to use CAPIF. Then the administrator will have to create a user. But first, the admin will have to log in with his credentials to obtain a token that gives him authorization to perform operations that the user cannot do. For example, create a user. To do this, on the login endpoint, we can use basic auth and the admin credentials to get two tokens. The access token that allows the admin to perform operations on the register, and the refresh token, which allows the access token to be updated without having to log in again. The admin token has an expiration time, so when it expires, we can use the refresh endpoint with the refresh token that we obtain from the login to obtain a new access token. Now, with the token, we can create a new user. To create a user, we must have information about that user. For example, the enterprise, the country, the email, and some optional fields like the phone number or company web. The important fields, in this case the username and password, can be given by the user or created by the admins and will be the credentials that the user will use to request the CAPIF access token. When we create a user, the register will associate an UUID and return it to us. This ID will be used by CAPIF to associate the invokers and providers with the users who created them. The user already has the credentials to obtain the information to use CAPIF and can create a provider or an invoker. Our next step will be to register a provider and publish an API in CAPIF. We will use some consoles that will make it easier for us to make all the requests and to show everything about them. So, using the credentials obtained previously, the custom user and user pass, making the request to the register service, we obtain all the data that we need to make the following request. These data are the access token necessary to register a provider or an invoker in CAPIF, the CR root certificate necessary to validate all the requests that we made, and the URLs where to make the request. Now we need to register the provider. To register a provider, we need to make a request to CCF API onboarding URL. As you can see, it's the same. And we need to use the access token that we obtain. With this, in the body, we have a list. In the request body, we have a list with the provider's functions that are the AEF that expose the API, the APF that is in charge of the publication of APIs, and the AMF that manage all the functions of the provider. Each of these functions is found with a CSHARE that identifies them. These CSHAREs are necessary for CAPIF to be able to expose the certificates of each function. So if we move to the response, we can see the location of the created resource, the ID of the new provider, And for each function, okay, for each of these functions, we will obtain an identifier and a certificate. In this case, the AEF identifier and certificate, the APF identifier and certificate, and the AMF identifier and certificate. From here, we will need to use a specific certificate for each request. As our next step is to publish an API, we will use the APF certificate and the publication URL. Okay. This is the publication URL, and in the body of the request, we will introduce a description of the API. This description contains the name of the API, in this case, demo API 1 OpenCAPIF, the ID of the AEF that exposes this API, and its resources. In this case, we have 3 resources: create VM, check VM, and remove VM, each one with its operations and descriptions. And finally, we also have the interface descriptions that contains the IP, the port, and the security methods supported by the API. In response, we find in the header the location of the resource and the identifier of the API. So with this, we will only have to start our API. We have our API already started. To register an invoker, we start by doing the same as with the provider. We ask for all the data necessary to register the invoker. So get out, debug, and as you can see, we use the credentials of the user that we create before. We make the request to the register service, and we obtain the same as the provider: the access token, the CR root certificate, and the URLs. Once we have everything, we can register the invoker using the CCF onboarding URL and the access token. So we register the invoker. Okay, using, in this case, the CAPIF URL with the CCF onboarding URL and the access token, we can register the invoker. In this case, the invoker only consists of one entity, so only one CCR will be needed. Here we can specify the CCR. And in the response, we obtain the location of the resource of the created resource, an identifier of the invoker, and the certificate also of the invoker. From now, we will use the certificate for all requests. So now, as an invoker, we are going to check which API are published in CAPIF using the Discover service. So if we put the Discover service debug mode, in this case we have only 5 published APIs. As we can see, the last one, the demo API 1 OpenCAPIF, is that the one that we published before, and this service also returns all the information about the APIs. If you remember, this API has three resources: create VM, check VM, remove VM, and we also can see the interface description. And with this, we will only have to choose which API we want to consume. Now what we want is to use the demo API 1, okay, demo API 1 OpenCAPIF, but we need to create a security context that allow us to obtain a token which is necessary to make the request. So the first request will be to create a security context for the API demo API 1 OpenCAPIF here, okay. And in the request, in this case, we use the security URL. In the request, we have a list with the preferred security method. In this case, is only OAuth because the API only supports OAuth as security method, and the information about the API, the AEF ID of that expose the API, and its ID. As response, CAPIF creates the security context and returns in headers the location of the resource. And in the body, we can see the selected security method to use. In this case, we only have OAuth. The selected security method is OAuth. And once the security context has been created, all we have to do is ask for the token to make the request. Okay, so get security token for the API 1. Okay, we request the token using our credentials, the invoker ID, and setting the scope of the token with the following pattern: the 3GPP hashtag AEF ID that expose the API, followed by the name of the API. And in response, we obtain the security token, the token type, in this case bearer, and the expires time. In this case, we have 10 minutes to use the token. Now we can make the request to the service that we have published. What this service will do is create a virtual machine in an environment that we have. So if we call service, this case the service demo AP1 OpenCAPIF, if you remember, we have three endpoints. In this case, we use the post method and the endpoint create VM. This endpoint also needs a body, so we are going to put here the root of the body, and if I make the request, we see that we use the token received, and we have created a machine called demo1 VM with the ID 1091. And with this, the demo will be end. We have been able to create a user as a CAPIF administrator, register a provider with which to publish an API, and register an invoker with which we have discovered all the APIs published in CAPIF and created a security context to use an API to consume said API.